With the 1968 album Friends, which failed to reach the top 100, their stock hit an all-time low. And even though Brian Wilson was still contributing strongly to the material and the production, they lacked a clear sense of direction. Unable to see any promise in the future, they looked to the past for salvation.
Because Friends had tanked so terribly in the United States, I think it hit number 126 on the Billboard Hot 100. You know, they kind of like scrambled. And they said, well, let's go back and do some basic Beach Boys sound. And this might have broken Brian's heart a little bit, but he went and he did a full-on version of it.
That single was Do It Again. And despite its nostalgia, the song's return to roots approach proved very current.
It's automatic when I'm talking with old friends and conversation turns to girls we knew when their hair was soft and long and the beach was a place to go.
I think Do It Again does fit into a general trend that is, you could argue, reactionary and nostalgic. In other words, pop music went so far out in 66, 67. You know, by the end of 67, you know, there's a sort of meltdown of structure and form. And I think there was almost in the sense of the kind of Jungian collective unconscious, there was a need to rein it back in. You know, suddenly there was a sort of hankering for the form and precision of the classic 3-minute pop or rock and roll single. You know, let's get back to basics, I suppose. You know, the Beatles with Lady Madonna is an obvious example. And the Stones reacting to the relative disaster of their Satanic Majesties by getting back to the sort of gritty blues bass that they'd started with, you know, Jumpin' Jack Flash. And in the same way, Do It Again is a statement, literally in the lyric and the arrangement and production. It's a statement that we're getting back to basics. We're going to do it again.
The lyrics tell one story, but then there's stuff going on in the music that are just sort of like of the now in 1968. And it wasn't like even the boomers, the baby boomers or people that age didn't have their moments of nostalgia too. And the thing is, the songs, you know, whatever the lyrics say, the song sounds so cool, like that very wickedly cool sort of compressed drum sound that runs through it, that sort of announces the start of the song. It's a very distinctive, very cool sound that does not occur on any other song. It's just in that song.
The distinctive production techniques were the brainchild of young engineer Stephen Desper, whose creative input would become essential to the band's growth in the following decade.
I came up with the sound for Do It Again, the drum sound at the beginning of Do It Again. It's a series of delays. They all went to lunch and I worked this sound out, and I played it for them when they came back saying, you know, this is pretty neat sound, it could be, and they liked it. And that pretty much was the point in time where they decided that I would be their mixer.
The single saw the band return to their former chart glory, taking the Beach Boys back into the US top 20 and hitting the #1 spot in the UK. If their aim had been to recapture their old style and increase their appeal, then they had succeeded. But it provided no clear roadmap for progression. And as they prepared to compile a final album for Capitol, Brian Wilson's commitment to the band was wavering and his mental state deteriorating. Where rudimentary recording equipment had been set up in his Bel Air house for sessions on all of the post-Smile albums, it was now decided that this should be developed into a fully functioning studio.
The home studio came about to entice Brian to become more involved in recording, because at that time he was ill and he was falling into depression more and more, and it was taking him and his creative talents away from what needed to be done. decisions have to be made from a business point of view as well as an artistic point of view. And it became very important to get Brian involved. So management and the Beach Boys made the decision that they would, with Marilyn, with her cooperation, would convert his informal living room, which had very high ceilings, soundproof it, and make it into a studio. And within about a week, we were in business. As far as actually being involved in the physical creation of the studio, Brian wasn't involved in that. His wife was, because it was really her house that she was giving up, and her privacy. But Brian came down one day and he wanted to paint everything. I thought he was going to paint it like a beige or something, but he came in and it turned out to be bright red here and bright green there and blue here, and it was very stimulating. The colors were stimulating. They weren't aesthetic so much, but it was a fun place to be in.
For Brian Wilson, the studio didn't prove to be so enticing. Instead of working on new compositions, he remained confined to his bedroom, listening to the Ronettes' Be My Baby on repeat, and recorded endless versions of the showboat musical number Old Man River. Not only had he lost his enthusiasm, the partial hearing he had suffered in his right ear since his youth was also now proving an obstacle in approaching modern recording techniques.
With the introduction of the Beach Boys going into stereo, Brian was kind of lost. For Brian to listen to the stereo, he told me what he would hear would be a double sound always, and it threw him off. So in order to get away from that, he had a single loudspeaker in the studio. And many times he would come in and make judgment calls that were right on. Even though he wasn't hearing it like we were, his judgment was right on.
Yet Capitol expected Brian Wilson's full involvement with Beach Boys' product. And as their main songwriter and producer retreated, it was up to other band members to step in and take the helm.
There was a lot of pressure on Brian from the record company. Give us a hit, give us a hit. And you know, you don't turn that on and off like a faucet. And so Brian, he's a sensitive guy, and he had a hard time with all this pressure. And his approach was to stay away. And during this time, he was unavailable. The record company is calling, hey, we've given you advances, come on, let's go, get in the studio, do something. All right, so Carl took over as a leader. And not only because he volunteered, but because he was the closest to Brian. And even though Brian was directly involved, he was indirectly involved with production through his brother, Carl.
Upon its release in February 1969, the songs that comprised the album 2020 heralded a new era for the Beach Boys, with Carl Wilson overseeing production and brother Dennis contributing significantly as a songwriter. Their final collection for Capitol Records, although it still failed to ignite the charts in the US, it was a major hit in Europe, boosted by the success of the album's second single, Carl's arrangement of the Phil Spector classic, I Can Hear Music.
This is the way I always dreamed it would be, the way that it is. Oh, when you are holding me, I never had a love of my own.
His first production, the first track where Carl kind of takes control, I Can Hear Music, is still, I think, an example of sort of regressiveness. It's Carl emulating Brian, emulating Phil Spector. So in that sense, it's kind of playing it safe. But I think there's more than enough evidence as time goes on that Carl holds things together. I mean, just in terms of his personality, in terms of the fact that he was, you know, the best singer by far, and that he cared.
Despite the accomplishments of the other band members, Capitol was still expecting a wealth of new Brian Wilson songs. Alongside Do It Again were the older, aptly titled compositions Time to Get Alone and I Went to Sleep. But with the once prolific songwriter unwilling or unable to contribute fresh material, it was finally decided that the Smile Vault should be reopened.
What was left? Well, there was all the stuff Brian had been working on that nobody knew how it went together. Only Brian did, and he wasn't saying. So Carl would bring the tapes into the studio, and we would listen to them, and I made copies of everything, and a game plan would come together, and we would splice things together and figure it out. As far as Cabinescence was pretty far along the way, as My Prayer was quite well recorded. We sweetened it, as it's called. We thickened it up, added some parts. Cabinescence was finished, some more or less with Brian's guidance through Carl. But as Carl would say, you gotta work with what you got.
Since time yellow, welcomes the time for a change.
2020 was lacking in Brian's personal involvement to a great degree, but he had left so many cool things in the can that it wasn't going to be hard to pull some great music, especially counterculture music with Cabinescence, you know, which was one of those great Smile, Van Dyke Parks, Brian Wilson songs. And that particular song made the group a bit relevant. I remember reading some underground magazines, late '69, some rap magazine from Detroit, saying, well, the Beach Boys have something going on here, because look, they got this song Cabinescence, and that's some real stuff. Anything that was going to leak from Smile, even if people didn't know it was from Smile, still worked and still communicated to the growing Woodstock audience.
The astonishing thing was you could put a Smile track on the back of an album and it would blow your mind. Like, where did this come from? You know, what is this? Because it sounds so distinct from, you know, in any year you released it, it sounded fresh and new, because even though it had been recorded years earlier, it was recorded in a style that no one had ever worked in and continued to not work in. These songs were sort of like of no time. They were out of the sort of cultural continuum of what you expected.
Shortly after the album's release, the Beach Boys once again issued a lawsuit against Capitol. And with only one more single owed to the label, the band and their management focused their attention on attracting new record companies. Yet in May, just before signing a lucrative deal with the European label Deutsche Grammophon, the reclusive Brian Wilson emerged at a press conference, declaring that the band were facing bankruptcy.
He didn't want to have to go back to work, which was essentially what all these contracts were calling him to do. You know, by then he'd had enough. And I mean, and he could read and understand when they told him, like, you will be responsible for, like, X percentage of these albums. And I think there were contractual obligations. Brian Wilson will write and produce X percent of the songs. He had become the provider, not just for his immediate family, but for his extended family, you know, for his cousins, and for their friends, and for their lawyers and colleagues. Everybody's invested in Brian continuing to work and be Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. But the only guy that didn't want that to happen was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys.
As the band headed out to Europe for a successful tour in territories where they were still big business, the reluctant Brian Wilson was nevertheless cajoled into working on the final Capitol single by his father, Murray. This domineering figure, who'd exerted so much pressure on his children during the early stages of their career when he oversaw their business affairs, was a presence that Brian had long since attempted to avoid. Yet convincing his son that the band needed a hit before moving on from Capitol, together they composed Breakaway.
Time will not wait for me.